All right, so today we are doing the Brain 1 lab, and this is going to be a lot. There's going to be a ton of stuff, and some of it we won't have gotten to yet. Most of it we won't have gotten to yet. But just keep working on it. We'll have a second brain lab that will also be a lot of stuff. So there's just, neuro just has so much to learn. Hopefully some of it is a little familiar to you, okay? So here is, we're gonna look at a few different brains. We're gonna start with this one, which is, this one is very nicely labeled for the outside. This is the cortex. This is called the cerebral cortex, right? When you think of the brain, this is all that wrinkly part that you see. Here's the cerebellum, which we'll talk about later, and then down here, this is the brain stem, which we'll spend more time on later. But so this whole wrinkly stuff is what we're gonna start with. We're gonna look at another brain here. This is a different model. This one is more useful. So here you can kind of see what it would more, it's really not colored like that with all the things marked on it. You know, a real cerebral cortex would look more like this. And this is even the kind of color it would likely be. All right. So, but we will use this one because it is nicely marked for the things that we're gonna talk about. So this is the anterior part, right? Here's the posterior part is where you get the cerebellum, and this is the medulla. The whole thing is called the brainstem, but the end part is the medulla. That's the part that goes into the spinal cord. All right, so we have right and left hemispheres. So you talk about the cerebral cortex having a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, and we'll talk about how those are specialized for certain functions, it seems, for most people. Then we're going to talk about a number of different parts, different lobes. All right, so just these will pretty much go along with the skull bones, so that's nice for you. In this model, they're going to be marked a little bit different. I think in the model that Grace has to do the quiz with you, so we'll just, hopefully that will be okay. But you can look up some in your book too. So the frontal lobe is going to be, when you're kind of looking at the brain, there's kind of this demarcation. This is going to be called a sulcus that we're going to learn, the lateral cerebral sulcus. Sometimes it's called the Sylvian fissure. That's, if you're following along with your lab notes, that's the second to last one. We'll come back to that later. But that's going to kind of show you, this is where the temporal lobe is. So this, we'll start with this one, I guess. So we'll start with the occipital lobe, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 down on your lab notes. This is the occipital lobe back here. This thing is different. This is a cerebellum, not part of the cerebral cortex, but this is the occipital lobe, all right? And this is particularly a particular part of it, but this whole yellow and green is kind of that, just where your occipital bone is, occipital lobe. Frontal lobe is gonna be this kind of right from this, oops, it includes this part. So it's gonna include the red here, which is called the motor cortex. We'll get that into a minute, but it'll be kind of everything in front of that. This is gonna be your frontal lobe. It doesn't include this part down here below this kind of line. So on this side, maybe you can see it better. It's kind of this red going up to the front and all that. This is the frontal lobe. Then this part here, that's kind of the blue and the purple here, this is the parietal lobe, goes right along with the parietal bone. You can kind of see it on this side. They've added some stuff, so this is easier to see the parietal lobe right there. And then this is the temporal lobe here. So here it's kind of clear. This is still the occipital, but with all this kind of light colored, this is the temporal lobe. Okay, so that's the lobes. And then we're gonna talk about these areas. So we kind of skipped the motor and sensory area. So on this one, the motor area is in red. And it's going to be, and on this side, this is also the motor area, but they talked about more different parts of it. So this is the motor area. And then the purple, dark purple here, that's the sensory area. So it's just this part, this kind of finger length part on both sides. This is also the sensory area. Here it's striped, all right? And those are going to be divided by something, this right here is called the central sulcus. So there is kind of a deepened sulcus we're going to talk about in the brain. Sulci are the grooves, and the gyri are the gyruses are the bumps. And so this is a groove. The central sulcus, it kind of goes along where the coronal suture is, more or less. All right. So that's the, I'm not sure if it's exactly aligned with it, but similar. So that's the central sulcus, and that divides really the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and it also divides this motor area here in red from the sensory area in purple. Okay, so the sensory area is part of the parietal lobe, the motor area is part of the frontal lobe. And we did the central sulcus. Then also that you have in your lab precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus. So gyrus is, like I said, referring to a bump. When you see the brain, right, here's bumps and sulci are the lines, all right? So here's, this I said was the central sulcus, that line that divides the motor from the sensory. So the bump here, the literal bump that you see right here, this is the precentral gyrus. Precentral gyrus, it's in front of it, and this is the postcentral gyrus, this bump here. So the precentral gyrus is the same as what area? Sensory or motor? Motor. So the precentral gyrus is the motor, same as the motor area. Like the motor area is kind of